Most people think silence is peaceful, but for some, silence is where old versions of themselves go to hide. The versions that used to cheer, used to glow, used to lift their hands and say, "Hey, look, I did something." This chapter isn't about loud victories. It's about the people who learned, somewhere along the way, to make their joy small. Not because they wanted to, but because life trained them to. You've met these people. Maybe you are one of them, the ones who brush off compliments like lint, the ones who downplay their wins so they won't look like they're trying too hard, the ones who keep their birthdays quiet, even though a tiny part of them wishes someone would remember without being told. They're not broken, they're not fragile, they're just tired. Tired in a way that doesn't look tired on the outside. And it didn't start with one big moment. It never does. Usually, it starts in childhood, where the early rules of self-worth get written. Some of these people grew up in homes where achievements were met with silence. Not dislike, just nothing. A kind of emotional shrug. Others grew up around people who made celebration feel like bragging, so they gradually learned to shrink themselves until their brightest moments fit into the smallest possible space. Some heard things like, "Don't make a big deal out of it." Other people have it harder. "Why are you showing off?" Or the classic, "Okay, but why didn't you do better?" Tiny comments, thrown into the air like casual dust, but inhaled so deeply that they settled permanently in the lungs. So a little kid who once danced around the living room becomes a teenager who stops announcing good news. That teenager becomes an adult who treats their own happiness like a side quest in a game they're not sure they're allowed to play. And here's the strange part. They often learn to get really good at celebrating other people. They'll hype up their friends' achievements. They'll attend every event. They'll show up with homemade cupcakes and heart-shaped messages and long paragraphs of encouragement. But when it's their turn, they freeze. It feels embarrassing, almost unsafe, to receive the same energy they give so easily. There's a grief in that, a hidden grief that rarely gets spoken aloud. It's the grief of knowing you've taught the world the wrong things about you, that you don't need praise, that you don't need recognition, that you don't need to be seen. And now the world believes it. Now people look at you and think, "Oh, they're fine, they're strong, they don't care about attention." But of course you care. Humans are wired to care. The desire to be seen isn't a flaw, it's a sign you're alive. Still, for the people in this story, wanting attention feels like admitting a weakness. So they fold themselves inward. They choose quiet. They convince themselves they don't need celebration, even when something inside them aches every time they let a milestone pass without acknowledging it. And they tell themselves, "It's fine, it's just another day," even though it's not. This chapter opens with that ache, the quiet, unspoken sorrow of people who no longer know how to clap for themselves. But here's where things get interesting, because buried under that grief is a long and complicated history, filled with small emotional moments that taught them to hide. If chapter 1 is about the quiet ache, chapter 2 is about the training, the early lessons that taught people it was safer to disappear than to shine. Because nobody wakes up one day and thinks, "I should hide my happiness." No, it's learned, slowly and subtly, like a language passed down without anyone meaning to teach it. And it always begins earlier than people think, not with trauma big enough to name, but with moments small enough that most adults don't even remember them. But kids do. Kids remember everything, especially the things that sting. Maybe it was a classroom where raising your hand made other kids roll their eyes. You answered a question correctly, and someone muttered, "Teacher's pet." Not loud enough for the teacher to notice, but loud enough for you to feel heat crawl up your neck. A small shame, but sticky. It stays. Or maybe it was at home. You came running to show a drawing you'd worked on, something you were proud of. Your mom or dad was busy, stressed, tired, distracted, and they said, "Not now." Not harsh, not cruel, but final. The moment died. Your excitement folded itself back into your chest like wet paper. And without realizing it, you learned celebration was inconvenient. Sometimes it was more direct. Some people grew up around siblings who competed for attention, so any win was treated like a threat. Or around parents who believed humility meant silence. Or in cultures where accomplishment had to be wrapped in apology to be acceptable. And then there are the kids who learned that good news created bad reactions. You tell someone you got an A. They say, "Must be nice." You mention you won something. They say, "Show off." You're excited about a hobby. Someone laughs. Not a big laugh, just a quick, sharp exhale that says, "Really? That's what you're proud of?" Those moments stack, not in a dramatic avalanche, but like dust layering a shelf. Thin, unnoticeable, inevitable. And before long, these small lessons form an invisible rule book. Rule number 1, don't draw attention to yourself. Rule number 2, pride is embarrassing. Rule number 3, people like you better when you're small. Rule number 4, asking for recognition makes you a problem. This is how quiet people are made, not by personality, but by conditioning. And the most tragic part? Kids don't know to question these rules. They just follow them, because following them keeps the peace. It avoids tension. It prevents ridicule. It makes the world easier to navigate, even if it costs something internal. So they grow up learning that the safest emotional posture is a slight hunch, the kind you don't notice until someone tells you to stand straighter and you realize you can't. What's important here is that the fear isn't actually about celebration itself. It's about the consequences of being seen. Kids don't fear joy, they fear reactions. They fear being misunderstood, mocked, ignored, or punished in ways they can't yet name. By the time they reach their teen years, the shift is complete. They become the ones who say, "It's no big deal," before anyone else can. They joke about their achievements, so no one else has the chance to do it first. They pretend they don't care, because caring is risky. And eventually, this becomes the foundation of who they believe they are. But adulthood complicates things even more. Because once you start living on your own, building a life, facing responsibilities and changes, something unexpected happens. You carry the old rules into a world that's no longer teaching them, but still enforcing them in your mind. By the time these people reach adulthood, their early lessons have hardened into something that looks, on the surface, remarkably admirable. They become the dependable ones, the quiet pillars, the steady shoulders, the friends who don't ask for anything but give everything. The ones who seem fine, even when they're barely holding themselves together. And it's strange how society rewards this kind of emotional self-abandonment. People love the strong one. They trust them. They lean on them. They never consider that maybe this strength wasn't born from confidence, but from a lifetime of believing their own needs weren't worth mentioning. But being the strong one is a tricky costume. It fits well at first, comforting even. It feels good to be needed. It feels safer to give than receive. It feels easier to listen to someone else's problems than to expose your own. Eventually, it stops being a choice and becomes your role in every room you walk into. These people become the friend who always checks in first, the co-worker who picks up the extra shift without complaining, the sibling who keeps the peace, the partner who says, "Whatever you want is fine, even when it's not fine at all." They don't announce birthdays. They don't talk about wins. They don't say, "Look what I did." Instead, they say things like, "It's nothing. It wasn't hard. It wasn't a big deal, even when it was everything, even when it cost them sleep, energy, or pride." But here's where the hidden grief grows thicker. They start being praised for the very behaviors that hurt them. "You're so easygoing. You're so humble. You never complain. You're the strong one. You're always there for everyone." They hear these compliments, and instead of feeling proud, they feel trapped. It's like receiving applause for a role you never auditioned for, but now can't escape. And deep down, there's an uncomfortable truth. Being the strong one means everyone assumes you don't need anything. People rarely ask how you're doing, genuinely doing, because you've trained them to believe you're bulletproof. And when you do need help, it feels unnatural to ask, almost shameful. There's a voice inside that whispers, "Other people need it more." Another voice says, "Don't burden anyone." A third voice insists, "You should be able to handle this." So they swallow it. They handle it. They handle everything. What people don't see is how lonely that becomes. Not dramatic loneliness, the kind where you cry on the floor with sad music playing, but a quieter, heavier loneliness that comes from being known only for your utility. It feels like being a chair, always supporting others, rarely considered on its own merits. And the worst part? They're so used to minimizing themselves that they can barely recognize the grief of it. They just call it being tired. They call it stress. They call it life. But the truth is simpler. They miss being celebrated. They miss feeling seen. They miss the version of themselves who once believed joy was allowed to be loud. Yet adulthood rarely gives space to confront this loss. It pushes you forward, into careers and responsibilities and routine. And in that rush, it becomes even easier to ignore your own emotional hunger. But hunger doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It grows. And by the time they start building careers, dating, making big decisions, something strange happens. Even their biggest achievements don't feel like achievements. They feel like flukes, accidents, things they shouldn't draw attention to. By the time these people settle into adulthood, something strange happens. Their accomplishments start to pile up, but their ability to feel accomplished shrinks even more. It's almost ironic. Life finally begins offering them the milestones they once dreamed about. But emotionally, they've lost the wiring to celebrate any of it. They get a promotion and think they probably couldn't find anyone else. They finish a big project and whisper internally, "I just got lucky." Someone compliments their skill and they respond with, "Oh, it's really not that good." It's like living inside a house where every mirror reflects a smaller version of you. No matter how much you achieve, you only see the flaws. No matter how high you climb, you feel like someone will discover you've been faking it the whole time. This isn't modesty. This is survival learned too early. A reflex, a protective shield. They learned as kids that being proud invited judgment. They learned as teens that drawing attention made them a target. So by adulthood, joy feels like something that needs to be pre-deflated before showing it to anyone else. What they don't realize is how exhausting this becomes. Take a moment and imagine this. You work hard, really hard. You deliver something impressive. You stay up late, push through doubts, solve problems no one else could solve. And when it's finally done, instead of feeling that warm, "I did it" glow, you feel nothing, or worse, shame for even thinking you might deserve to feel proud. That's the reality for these people. Every milestone becomes another quiet moment where they pretend it doesn't matter. What makes adulthood even harder is the comparison culture around them. Friends posting highlight reels online, co-workers bragging confidently in meetings, people celebrating themselves loudly, boldly, unapologetically. On the outside, they seem unfazed. On the inside, there's a deep, aching question. Why can't I do that? Why does pride feel dangerous? Why does everyone else seem to belong in their victories, while I feel like an intruder in mine? Achievements that should have been trophies start feeling like paperwork, something to file away quietly so you don't bother anyone, something you minimize until even you forget how much work it took. And here's where the hidden grief becomes even more complicated. Because if you never celebrate your wins, people assume you don't have any. Not that they think you're failing, just that they don't realize how much you're doing. You forget to share good news. You downplay everything. You keep successes so close to your chest that the world never sees them. Which leads to this painful cycle. You accomplish something. You hide it. No one acknowledges it. You feel unseen. You stop trying to be seen. You hide even more. And eventually, you begin believing that maybe your achievements really aren't worth celebrating. The saddest part is that many of these people don't even know they're grieving. They think this is what being an adult feels like. They think everyone feels this invisible emptiness. They think their inability to feel proud is a personal flaw rather than a learned reaction to old wounds. But those old wounds don't stay in childhood. They follow you into your friendships, your romantic relationships, your workplace. And soon, the people around you begin expecting less from you emotionally, because that's the version of you they've been introduced to. By the time these people form real adult relationships, friendships, work bonds, romances, they've already mastered the art of emotional understatement. And even though they don't consciously realize it, this shapes every connection they build. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in subtle, quiet imbalances that grow heavier with time. In almost every group, there's that one person everyone vents to. The one who listens without interrupting. The one who remembers birthdays, troubles, milestones. The one who shows up at 2 a.m. The one who keeps the peace, softens the blow, sets aside their own mood to make space for someone else's. That's them. That's the person who learned early on that their worth comes from caretaking, not celebrating. They become emotional furniture, comfortable, reliable, taken for granted. And the irony is that people genuinely love them, deeply. But they love the version that doesn't need much, the version that's easy, the version that listens more than speaks, the version that never asks for support in return. So relationships become lopsided without anyone intending harm. Friends think they're strong, they don't need help. Partners assume they're low maintenance, they don't need reassurance. Co-workers rely on them. If they took it on last time, they can take it on again. Individually, none of these assumptions are cruel. Together, they create a quiet starvation. These people give so much emotional labor that they eventually forget what it feels like to receive it. Not because others don't care, but because they stopped signaling that they need care. They hide their struggles so well that even the most loving people in their lives don't see them. Imagine living like this. You're always the one who asks, "How are you really?" But no one asks you back in the same tone. Not because they don't love you, but because you've trained them to believe you're fine. You celebrate others loudly, but your wins pass unnoticed. You comfort others through heartbreaks, but cry alone to avoid being dramatic. You help people move, cope, rebuild, restart, yet can't remember the last time someone checked in on you unprompted. It's not that these people want grand gestures. They don't want surprise parties, parades, or standing ovations. They want something much simpler: to be acknowledged without asking for it, to be seen without performing strength, to belong without shrinking. But here's the bittersweet twist. When someone finally does try to celebrate them, they can't fully receive it. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Acts of kindness feel suspicious. Being prioritized feels unearned. They say things like, "You didn't have to. I'm fine, really. I don't want to bother anyone." As if needing support is a moral failing. And this dynamic, this constant giving without receiving, slowly wears down even the strongest self-image. It creates resentment they never voice, loneliness they never articulate, a heaviness that builds quietly, like water rising in a room they pretend isn't flooding. Then comes the moment, sometimes years in the making, when it all becomes too much. Not because of one big event, but because of a lifetime of emotional micro-sacrifices that finally reach capacity. And that moment, the silent breaking point, is where the story shifts. Because even the strongest, quietest, most self-contained people eventually face a truth they've avoided. You can't keep pouring from a cup you never refill. The breaking point almost never looks like a breakdown. It rarely comes with shouting, crying, or dramatic revelations. For people who've spent their whole lives swallowing their own emotions, collapse tends to arrive quietly, like a soft snap inside the chest that no one else hears. It might start with something small, a text left unread a little too long, a task they normally handle feeling impossible, a moment where someone forgets to thank them, and instead of brushing it off like usual, it lands heavier than it should. Or maybe it's a milestone, something big, something they should be proud of, that passes without acknowledgement. A job promotion, a personal victory, a creative achievement. And the people around them respond with the same shrug the world has been giving them since childhood. Except this time, it hurts. Not the sharp kind of hurt you can point to. The dull kind that expands quietly, like fog filling a room. A realization hums beneath the surface. I'm living a life where I'm never celebrated. Not by others. Not even by myself. Sometimes it's triggered by watching someone else receive the kind of support they've never allowed themselves to need. A friend gets comforted openly. A co-worker gets praised loudly. A sibling gets their moment of pride. And there's no jealousy. Not really. It's more like a sudden awareness. I don't get that. I've never gotten that. For some, the breaking point is physical. Exhaustion that doesn't go away. A sudden burst of tears in a grocery store. Feeling overwhelmed by decisions that used to be easy. The body keeps score long after the mind stops paying attention. For others, it's emotional. A conversation where they finally say, "I'm tired," and someone responds with, "Of what? You seem fine." A moment where they realize no one knows the real depth of their struggles because they've hidden it too well. A creeping sense that the strong one isn't actually strong. They're just practiced at suffering quietly. But the real breaking point happens inside, often without witnesses. It's not one moment, but a sudden understanding. I've built a life where my own joy has no place. I've become someone I don't even celebrate. That realization is brutal. It's like waking up from a long sleep and seeing how much of yourself you've abandoned just to keep everything running smoothly for everyone else. And here's the part no one talks about. When you've spent an entire life not needing anything, it feels terrifying to admit that maybe you do. Maybe you want someone to cheer for you. Maybe you want to feel proud without apologizing. Maybe you want to take up space without shrinking, even if just a little. This internal shift is messy. These people don't suddenly become expressive or confrontational. They don't start asking for everything they've been denied. Instead, they feel lost, caught between who they've always been and who they're afraid they might become if they finally speak up. It's a limbo, a stretch of emotional grey. The old coping mechanisms don't work anymore, but the new ones haven't formed yet. It feels like standing in a hallway between two locked doors. But hidden inside this heaviness is something important, something they don't recognize at first. A desire to change, a tiny spark of rebellion against the quiet life they've lived. Not a loud revolution, just a whisper that says, "I want something different." And that whisper becomes the beginning of healing. Not dramatic, not quick, but real. Healing doesn't start with grand epiphanies. It starts with tiny, uncomfortable moments. Moments that feel so small they seem meaningless. But for people who've spent their entire lives shrinking themselves, these small acts are nothing short of rebellion. The first step is usually something subtle. They accept a compliment without arguing. Not gracefully, more like stiffly nodding and saying, "Oh, thanks," even though their instinct screams to deflect. That's step one, letting a kind word land without immediately sweeping it off the table. Then comes step two, sharing good news with someone they trust. Maybe they got promoted. Maybe they hit a personal milestone. Maybe they created something they're proud of. And instead of keeping it hidden to avoid making a big deal, they send the text or make the call. Their heart races the whole time because deep down they're waiting for the reaction they learned to fear years ago. Dismissal, jealousy, mockery. But sometimes the reaction is warm. Sometimes someone says, "I'm so proud of you." And it doesn't hurt. It feels strange, and then it feels good. Another step follows, allowing themselves tiny private celebrations, buying their favorite dessert after finishing a difficult task, taking a day off without feeling guilty, saving little screenshots of messages that made them smile. These aren't grand gestures. They're breadcrumbs leading back to themselves. But unlearning self-erasure isn't clean or linear. There are setbacks, days when they shrink without thinking, moments when asking for help feels too heavy, times they still say, "It's not a big deal," even when it is. Healing for them feels like walking with new shoes. Blisters at first, awkward steps, uncertainty about where to put their weight. But slowly, the fit becomes natural. And then something big happens. Not big in the world's eyes, but big internally. They start to notice the voice inside them that wants celebration. A voice that says, "This matters." A voice that says, "I did well." A voice that says, "I deserve to be proud." This voice isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It just needs space. Space that was once filled with fear, shame, and reflexive humility. Relationships begin shifting too. They learn to say things like, "Actually, I could use some support," even if it comes out shaky. They learn to let others show up for them, even if only in small ways. They learn that emotional reciprocity isn't selfish, it's connection. And the people in their lives often respond with surprise, but also relief. Because loving the strong one is easier when they allow themselves to be human. People feel honored to support someone who spent so long carrying everything alone. Their world doesn't transform overnight, but it starts to feel warmer, fairer, more balanced. And with each small step toward celebrating themselves, the grief that once lived under their skin begins to loosen its grip. It doesn't disappear entirely. Old wounds don't vanish just because you've outgrown them. But they stop defining every interaction. They stop narrating every success. They stop deciding who you're allowed to be. By now, these people are no longer stuck in the hallway between two locked doors. They've found a third door, one they never knew existed. And that leads them into the final transformation. Not becoming a new person, but finally becoming the version of themselves they were always meant to be. One who owns their worth without apology. The final stage of this journey isn't loud or cinematic. It doesn't end with fireworks or big speeches or dramatic declarations. For people who spent years hiding their light, the real victory is found in the quiet moments. The ones where they finally feel aligned with themselves. This chapter is about that alignment. They wake up one morning and realize the world feels a little less heavy. Not because their problems disappeared, but because they're finally carrying them with both hands instead of pretending they don't exist. They speak more openly now. Not constantly, not dramatically, but honestly. If something good happens, they tell someone without rehearsing how to minimize it. If something hurts, they say, "That bothered me," instead of swallowing it whole. And the strangest thing? People respond with warmth, something they never believed they deserved. Because the truth is, the world wasn't refusing to celebrate them. They were refusing to be seen. Now, they're seen. Not in a spotlight, but in a way that feels human. Relationships change too. Not all of them survive this shift. Some people preferred the version who never needed anything. But the ones who stay, the ones who cheer, who listen, who show up, those become the foundation of a healthier life. And internally, something settles. Those old childhood rules, the ones that whispered, "Stay small and don't take up space," begin to lose their power. Not erased, but overwritten by new truths. I'm allowed to be proud. I'm allowed to be seen. I'm allowed to matter. Self-celebration becomes a habit rather than a threat. Not in an arrogant way, in a grounded, steady way. Like thanking yourself for surviving, recognizing your effort, acknowledging your growth. They begin keeping track of victories. They save praise instead of dismissing it. They look in the mirror and see someone who has earned their place, not someone who stumbled into it by accident. And perhaps the most healing moment of all is this. They no longer feel guilty for wanting to be celebrated. They understand that being witnessed is not a luxury, it's a basic human need. Eventually, they find balance. They can be strong, but not at the cost of their own well-being. They can be humble without disappearing. They can support others without abandoning themselves. They become someone who says, "I'm proud of myself," without immediately following it with an apology. And as they move through life with this new sense of self-worth, something beautiful happens. The grief that once defined them transforms. It becomes insight. It becomes compassion. It becomes a quiet understanding of others who are still learning to unhide themselves. Because now, they can recognize that familiar dimness in other people, the ones who deflect praise, who laugh off their accomplishments, who shrink without even noticing. and they know exactly what it means. In the end, this isn't a story about celebration itself. It's a story about permission. Permission to exist fully. Permission to feel joy without shame. Permission to take up emotional space. Permission to stop apologizing for being human. These people don't become new, they become whole. And that is the most powerful celebration of all.